Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, August the 11th, 2019, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and whatever else Dave has been up to.
Firstly, an excellent blues festival. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of WEF people, including Bob Polinsky and Laurie Coey especially, have been involved in that festival, that people were enjoying it. There was audience participation, there was dancing, and there was a second band shell, so when one band was transferring to another on the main shell, there would be music to the side. An excellent wine tasting at WEFT. The principle was that there were 12 businesses in downtown Champaign that you could visit and taste wine and perhaps buy wine that you liked. And that was set up in WEFT, and many people came and saw WEFT for the first time, and that was good. Music festivals are good. Friday night, a young woman singing and playing different instruments and bringing in other people. I thought that was good, and it was followed by Dustin Danger, but he's a brother of he's a Liggett family member, and he has been on WEFT as on a Monday night for WEFT sessions, and he was a banker and decided to go to music full time, so he was there. I'm interested in the fact that he's from Oakwood, because we have rail trails there. I'm kind of interested that the musicians interact with children, especially. The children are interested in exploring everything, and the parents have to follow them just to see that they don't hurt themselves. But they clap and they dance and run around. And the general population interacts with each other, and I just find that rather interesting. I met up with people. Ralph Sen told me that he has now 1.5 acres of pollinator prairie, and you might not know him, but he's one of the brothers that runs Garcia's Pizza, and has a balloon that you see in the sky every once in a while. The Sierra Club had a meeting at Sleepy Hollow, which is at Oakwood, just south of, and the Sierra Club is trying to encourage Vermilion County participation. They have some big issues, which include the possibility of a mine, a coal mine, and the taking out of the very good aquifer water and washing the coal and putting it back down into an aquifer nearby as tainted water. So there's been a lot of action on that front. There's fly ash stored in borrow pits that are near the salt fork of the Vermilion, and it's leaking into this rather unique river, and that's an issue. There's natural history issues, including the rail trail that runs through Oakwood, and I was interested to see that the township supervisor hasn't not mown the prairie that's between Bronson and Oakwood, and that I have to thank Kevin Green for interjecting there and explaining that this was a prairie, and although you can mow portions of it at times to get rid of weeds, it usually is not mown. It's more likely to be burned with a controlled burn. So that was good. I managed to read the detail. It was in my head, and I thought it was went from 8 on, which we've done with the fundraisers before, but it was really it finished at 8, so I missed the meeting, but I did go early with the intent of following the trail through Oakwood. The Oakwood Trail has been very well developed. It's probably about 3 miles long. It starts on the west side of Oakwood, on the east side of the Doris Westville Prairie that we're concerned about, and continues through to Bucktown and Mission Field. It looks as if it's going to be wide, but that seems to be the definition. And that's okay through the town and also through Mission Field, because it was a coal mining area and very disturbed, so it doesn't really have a lot of native vegetation. The trail through the Oakwood has been it's wiggly woggly. It sort of moves and curves around war memorial monuments and lawns and gives it character. In order to do that, you have to be in on the planning device early on, so that the trail will be approved by the Surface Transportation Board at the federal level. Then it will be approved by the Department of Transportation, which is in charge of bicycles as a alternate form of transportation. And then the Natural History Survey is, the Department of Natural Resources and its bicycle division is concerned about the vegetation and the bicycle way use. So, considering that trail is in action at the present time, the next portion of the trail we hope will be the 100-foot high, quarter-mile long bridge that goes over the Salt Fork of the Vermilion, and that will allow Oakwood to access the Kickapoo State Park and possibly in the future to Danville. There's at Doris Westville Prairie, a mile on the west side of Oakwood, and it's a very good prairie. It's where many of us have picked seed over the years, and especially Doris Westville picked seed there to take this forest ground and create a very biodiverse prairie at Forest Glen, which is part of the Vermilion County Conservation District. And that prairie is in jeopardy if a trail comes through from East St. Joe through Ogden and Fithian and ends up at Bronson. Between Bronson and Oakwood, there's this piece of remnant prairie. If a trail goes through as wide as it has been between Urbana and St. Joe, there will be no prairie left. What I would like to recommend is that the bicycle trail be taken off onto the parallel road. The 150, Highway 150, takes a route around the south end of Oakwood. It's not running through Oakwood, but this 1 mile of cutoff is very useful for people who want to get straight into Oakwood. So this is a popular corridor, and it's traveled quickly, and it's relatively narrow. But I would suggest that the bicycle population be taken onto that narrow road, and that it be labeled a shared corridor, and that the traffic be asked to recognize the value of the prairie that's adjacent. The fact that the prairie would be adjacent would also allow people to be more educated about a prairie. There's some trees on it that don't belong, but basically it's a site we can't replicate elsewhere. There's always the argument that there's compromise, that a trail will help people see what a prairie is. Well, it doesn't happen that way if you don't have any prairie to see. And a trail may be useful and recreational, but do we have the right to take out the prairie that's on either side that's reasonably well established? I don't think so. When the state has only preserved 0.01% of its two-thirds prairie, then you're down to almost nothing. And the friendly objective of compromise is when you have nothing, there's no compromise left. And so this is an important site. And the whole of Oakwood area, from the Polywogs to Conkey Town to the Salt Fork that runs through to the mining era, it provides a very interesting and diverse biological interest. The ponds that are a result of strip mining may be of various age, so they can be checked for the microorganisms that grow in them. And so there's an academic interest in those sorts of studies. There's underground geology, which has allowed for the accumulation of Carboniferous era vegetation and compaction to form coal. So there has been a lot of coal activities, and when it was initiated, it was deep mining in a mine shaft, but later it got to be strip mining, where you take the overburden off just the same way as you would plow a field, and then you have access to the coal. You take the coal out, and then you take another furrow and you replace it. So this is a different form of mining and more efficient. Trees have been planted that replace the areas that have been disturbed, and it's a popular site for people to not only visit but to dwell there. There are people who have a weekender in that area, and Natural History Survey members have plots over there because they study the river, and some of it is limestone. You can actually walk into the river and you're not into glaciated material, you're standing on limestone. There was a covered bridge there at Conkytown, and just a lot of sociological interests. And this is a sort of area that we cherish because it relates to other areas like the corridor that we're talking about on 45. This is an east-west corridor that can run into that sort of north-south corridor. But do we do it mainly for recreation? If you're in a forest preserve district, then you're more likely to have a mandate for recreation. George Fell, who put together the Nature Conservancy, worked with ecological union people a long time ago, and it's very sad to see the prairie that these mentors used to disappear. That piece of history is now gone. So I don't want that to go right through St. Joe to Ogden, Fithian, and the like. It'd be very hard to convince anyone because it looks rambunctious. It has trees on it. As you go from St. Joe, the area between St. Joe and the Union Pacific Railroad has been heavily mown, which was 20 years ago was excellent prairie. If it was allowed to grow, it would be there, but you would have to educate a whole development that's on the northeast side of St. Joe. When you get onto that bridge and look towards Ogden, there you also have the potential for railroad right-of-way areas that have been there when the railroad was put in, but the edges on either side were reasonably undisturbed, and there's an interurban, and we look to that to preserve some of the dignity of the soils at least, and the microorganisms in the soil. So that's another topic for debate. Once you get to Vermilion County, there is a conservation district which has more of a mandate to preserve, and we hope that they might do things like preserve the Doris Westfall Prairie and also the several miles of railroad right-of-way prairie. It will take talent because there's a big move to recreation, and I don't think there's a realization that the prairie counts. It's about 50 times easier to preserve a forest than it is to preserve a prairie. And so this is a small gem that we're likely to lose very shortly. I would like to see a narrower trail and the preservation of the prairie. And perhaps not so much demand for putting in gravel to cap, C-A-P, cap any possible creosote, and to do that down the side of the railroad bed so you also lose the prairie there. There's always the argument that there's mitigation, and mitigation means that if you take out a prairie with 50 or 80 species in it and perhaps thousands of bacteria and fungi in the soil, you can replace it by putting in 25 prairie plants and hope that it simulates what was there. It's not so. So mitigation doesn't give us back a prairie. It might be enough for people to see a little prairie on the way. That's helpful, but genetically, we want the prairie. We do not know what you might find as a biochemist in a compass plant. Many of the plants that the drugs that we use come from plants, and if you don't have them, you're in bad shape. One drug that comes from the Amazon is one that's used in freeing up heart vessels so that you don't have a heart attack. And that had to come from a biochemical. And likewise, we don't know what is in our prairie, and we have very little of it left to work with. And if someone from the rest of the world wants to utilize that ecosystem, they are denied it too. So I would like to see the trail between St. Joe and Oakwood be somewhat narrower. I think it's 10 or 12 feet wide now, but you don't need that much to have a bicycle move along it. I also watch volunteer mowing. It's a matter of people feeling that there's a neatness syndrome, but in some places where there was good prairie, there is now mowing that takes out all the species that are there. It will take talent for people to say, excuse us, but this is the right-of-way that the public owns, and we do not really want your mowing. That's a big debate. So we change directions a little. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock at next to Weft, we will have a teasel crew. It's short notice, but we are faced with a teasel plant that comes to cemeteries as a dried arrangement. It is a very interesting dried arrangement and gets used in wreaths a lot, but it has thousands of seeds in it. When they dry, they shake out and they become a regional menace. We're close to a cemetery, and we have 9 acres there that is a gravel pit. The gravel pit is glacial till left by the moraines, and it's almost like going back 10,000 years and encouraging the regrowth of the prairie. We have the advantage of nearby prairies that surround the gravel pit, and nearby, like an old interurban and railroad bed right away, that gives us an idea of what the remnant prairie was like, and we can dipsy-doodle into the borrow pit, gravel pit, and speed up the time frame that it would have taken a prairie to come in from the east or the west or the south, and sometimes from the north, where there's been the glacier has moved around an unglaciated area. So we're speeding up the regrowth succession. But we can't have weeds, and one of the weeds is teasel. And we are not really excited about herbicide, but it's almost impossible to get at this plant without you spot herbicide, just the plant. And we miss some, and those some have their seeds in their milk stage at the present time. So we cut those If we don't have time to depod them, then we will leave them to rot. We need to get there early enough so that the stems are still in a stage that they will rot. The more efficient thing is, if you have time to do it, is to take a bucket and take off the head when the plant is standing. And the plants are about 10 feet tall in some cases, so it's not easy to harvest that way. So rough and tough, we take a wire whip and slash them down. So we're inviting you to come and not only slash, but to find out where the prairie is. I'll tell you roughly, in case you're interested. It's 1 mile north of Rantoul. That means about 18 miles from Champaign-Urbana, and takes about half an hour. And you go through Rantoul on Route 45, and then you start to climb up to Bloomington Moraine, and the road bends out to the east a little bit to go around Maplewood Cemetery. And that's part of our problem, is we're near a cemetery where there's some of the seed source for teasel. We would hope that in days ahead that horticulturalists and florists would not use teasel, but it's still available, and it still creates a mess. The rosettes are about 2 feet across. It's a biennial. It takes 2 years to grow, but it has a dimension of rosette of leaves that shade out any prairie underneath, and it's a most unfortunate weed. So we'll be harvesting teasel, and you're welcome to come. Let me stress again where we're going. It's 1 mile north of Rantoul on Route 45. You move out around the cemetery, and then there's a section road which is 3200, and it's the first section road north of the cemetery. And we own a little triangle there, and you can recognize that there's an old Route 45 hidden in the bushes, and it's adjacent to our prairie. So on that little area, you very quickly come to a railroad line. If you go to the railroad line, you've gone too far. So you only have to go about 50 yards in on the left or the west on that corridor, and you'll find a yellow gate, which is designed to stop dumping on the prairie area. And the Department of Transportation has been very helpful with that gate. It's been tremendous. If you have a key, you can drive down there. The prairie is about a quarter mile down. We have a lot of dumping from the past, and we're hoping to put in a hi-ho and get some of that dumping closed out. The Department of Transportation took out a lot of stuff, and some of it's from individuals, but some of it is from dump trucks that know better. So the gate is designed that you don't get a dump truck through it. If you do, you know you're doing the wrong thing. So we were very pleased with that. And the prairie is doing well. It's coming back on the gravel with regrowth succession. The liatris plant will be 2 feet high, not 4 feet high. It will be in amongst a lot of gravel, which is glacial till dropped by the moraine that was there, the Bloomington Moraine, continental glaciation. But that till it was taken off, 8 feet of it has gone to road pack because it's very good road pack. So we're on bare earth, and it's probably 75 years into action now. The plants are still small. They will have deep roots, and they gradually are accumulating organic matter. So if you look at a little clump you'll see that there are probably 5 or 6 species there, and they're accumulating organic matter. There's not enough organic matter or litter for a burn, so this will go with probably without burn for quite some time. There are some invasive trees, cypress trees that don't belong, and that's for the future. We do need a fence because the area has a little creek in it, and when it's wet, it gets to be rather muddy, and it's an invite for off-road vehicles to enjoy getting into a bog and messing around, and they can do 70 years worth of damage in 20 minutes, and so we really need a fence. I haven't had the money to do that, but we're hoping. This is a little prairie which we cherish. It's not the ideal remnant. The remnants are around where the gravel was not removed, and it's on the railroad right-of-ways next door and on the side of the old Route 45. So if you would like to come to 115 North Market, which is next to the west, at 9 o'clock, and we'll be heading there. If you want to go independently, Liz Kirby is coming to pick up a key so that she will start at 8 o'clock, and others may want to start early to avoid the heat. We won't go for too long. If you only want to come and find out where the prairie is, that's okay. If you want to work with us for half an hour, that's tremendous. You would be amazed what you can get done in a half an hour or an hour. We will probably leave probably in the vicinity of 1 o'clock, but we just don't want to see any of those teasel heads putting seed into a prairie for years to come. We have some other weeds, including autumn olives, and interestingly, this site is adjacent to a right-of-way, a dual highway, the second leg of which was not developed because 57 went in, and so that provides a space for ash trees, and the ash trees have succumbed to emerald ash borer. But as the ash trees die, the native prairie that's underneath has been coming out of the woodwork, and that's interesting, and it's adjacent to the pocket prairie. The pocket prairie is named Pope Prairie because as your headlights went around the curve that goes around the cemetery, they head onto billboards that were on the curve. But once 57 went in, that was no longer a lucrative place for advertising, so we were able to buy that 9 acres. And we'd like to buy a little bit more between us and the cemetery. It's farmland, and 6 acres of it has been bought by the cemetery for new graves, but about another 5 or 6 acres is not being farmed at the present time, and we would like to extend the prairie. The Rantoul and Ludlow townships have put in a road, and that's very helpful for the cemetery, but it's also helpful for us. And we'll put a gate. I think they'll put a gate on the south end so that if we have to bring in a busload of volunteers, we can go down the old Route 45 and out the other end. At the moment, it's not easy to turn a bus on a narrow corridor, so you have to walk people in, and that takes time. If you are interested, call me at 840-1911. 840-1911. Bring water, bring nibbles, and bring boots. This is not a place for short shorts. And you might need some off or something to discourage any wildlife from crawling up your legs. But we'd be interested in having it.
I've never heard insects called wildlife before, but I guess there really are. We actually had a caller mention one thing you haven't mentioned yet is bring gloves. This isn't a walk in the park. You'll probably want to protect your hands. You never know. There could be something you're allergic to.
Yes, it's prickly, and that's why it's called teasel. This head was used for teasing wool, so before you weaved it, so you would wouldn't have little lumps in the skein of wool that you were preparing for further processing, and those little projections can be mean. So a good pair of gloves that fit you is a helpful thing. And so let me look at the time we have.
20 minutes.
Okay. I would like to. I was talking to Kim Campbell, the beekeeper who has a yellow truck and sells honey at the farmers market. And Kim is a board member, and we sometimes retreat to a shady spot and talk for a while. Well, somehow we got in the conversation of bricks, and he'd been looking at a program where he's starting to understand about bricks, and that reminded me that every country that is going through development has had to go through technologicals that are simple, or seem simple to us these days, whether it's taking down a tree and creating a beam, or sawing wood with one person in a pit and one person above, and making planks, and whether it's early transportation, which may have been canoe, may have been paddle wheeler, and creating housing and buildings. And one of those ways of doing that would be to have sod and pile sod on top of each other and on the roof. And so there were some fairly what we would regard as primitive ways of surviving. But that could improve. You could have a little wall that you put shrubs. You would cut planks and put into the mud that you would create. And it's called wattle and daub. It's where Australians especially have an acacia, which is a regrowth succession plant that can be used in making a wall. And you could have some sawn timber, but lots of young trees. In Australia, it's hard to get untwisted young trees. So your log cabin, if it had logs up the side as well as walls, or whether you had a support for bark, which was another way of creating a house, especially for the roof. It sheds water. You come up with a log cabin that is fairly unique, and probably with a soil false floor, and but it was still protected from wind and rain and sun, and that went on here too. And when you were in a small community, you couldn't go buy 1,000 bricks to put in a house. You had to use the soil that was available to you. You went looking for clay, so knowing your soil types, you might choose not to use a Drummer or a Flanagan, very deep organic soil, you'd look for a Xerox, a more dry site, and you would look for clay. Well, and you'd make bricks by hand. You would have a mold which you would put your mud in there. You would mix up the clay and make it damp enough that it could be molded. You'd put it in there and shake the mold and have it dry in the sun. As you got more sophisticated, you might do several at once, and you might look for a soil that's less friable. I nearly brought in some bricks which were early bricks, then you could actually see people's finger marks in them. As you get more sophisticated, you get it's a horse era, so you don't have any motors, so you have a horse circle around and create power, and you would grind up your clay in small pieces, and then add water, and the horse would drive a set of spindles that would mix up the mud, and then you would take that mud to your table to create a brick, and you even if you only made 20 bricks in a day, that was progress, folks. Then you come from an era to steam engines, and you could motorize some of this activity, and you could take that mixture and you could add things to it, and you could compress it, and you could do perhaps 100 bricks a day, and gradually there's a history here of how you put together your wood and your bricks, and sometimes they get saved. Some of them are street bricks, and street bricks sell very well. They add a little salt before they go into a kiln, and so you then have kilns that are created with enough room for you to put the bricks in, the green bricks. They're sort of still sloppy, but they can be moved in, and you have breezeways so that a fire that you you start with wood, if you have wood. In Champaign County was 94% prairie, so you didn't have a lot of wood. So then you might have to have something else to fire things with. And so the creation of those early kilns is interesting. And if you go to places like Towanda over by Bloomington, you will find places where bricks were made. But there was also a drainage problem in East Central Illinois, and so they were very dependent on making short sections of pipe that were ceramic pipe. You've probably seen them around. They get broken every once in a while. They're usually about 4 feet under the ground, but sometimes they get exposed. And they were used to reticulate under the soil that was in fields that were being made available by drainage. Then they have been replaced by plastic pipe, which is more efficient, and so the brick kilns still work, and the pipe part of them is more or less obsolete. And some of the brick kilns have gotten to be bigger and bigger. And they're usually located where there is a source of clay that's appropriate. You also have to know that these people had to have a mortar to stick the bricks together. So you had to have limestone, and you had to burn it to create limestone, and then you had to have hogs' hairs or other materials to put into that mortar and to put the bricks together. And you can see in an old building where the bricks were sometimes different sizes. They sometimes had more mortar and less mortar. And that's part of the fun of the history. Not very many of these items have been preserved. We were talking about Hinesborough and some old buildings that were the township buildings in Hinesborough. And we got to realize that sometimes people will take these bricks and reuse them, which is a little bit cruel if you're trying to preserve the dignity of the history. You also have to look at the transportation. Over by Peoria, there's a fellow who they had a plot of land near a cemetery, and his parents were well educated, and he got to be doing a master's degree at the University of Illinois, and he got to invent a equation for a watch spring, so that watch springs that broke regularly were much stronger. And so when he made money doing that, he retired to his parents' plot of land, and he created a house. He didn't believe in beasts of burden, so he would come with bricks. He would have 6 or so bricks on his bicycle and create a house that is very interesting. So there are forms of how you move these things across, how you move them around the world. It was not easy to transport your stuff if you didn't have a railroad line. You might want to take your corn and put it to being alcohol, because it was easier to move alcoholic beverages than to move the grain itself. So even if you were in a fairly reserved religious background, that was sometimes what you did to move a crop. You could have paddle wheelers come up the river. I remember when I first came here, I borrowed some pictures from the Ricker Library, and one of the pictures was a paddle wheeler way up in the Missouri River, and he got arrested, I think, for being drunk, and his paddle wheeler was sitting there, and the river went down. So there it was, stuck for some time. So you could only use a paddle wheel at certain times in flood time. And so that was a form of transportation. You could have canals that would have a horse that would drag on a towpath, would drag a barge. And then that was almost in vogue when railroads came, and railroads could go in other places. So railroads took over, and eventually the railroads, which went everywhere, have been obsoleted by main lines and regular transportation, motor vehicles. So trying to keep together some of this history so you remember it and have something for your great-grandchildren to know how people lived in in the 1800s or the 1700s or the 1900s. And so, so there were other industries that needed. One of them was that you needed to grind your grain. It's not very happy to have to eat, probably with teeth that weren't so good, grains of wheat. So you had to have a big stone and a stone on top of it. This would be a circular stone, and you would have little lines out of it so that when you created grain that was crushed, it would be able to come out one of those areas, and that granary or that grist mill could be run by hand if you had holes in the upper disc and could move with one or two people and grind the grain that was there. Some of those grist mills are still around. Not very many, but they're part of our history. When you got more sophisticated, you got a horse and you made the horse walk around. And if you've gotten to know horses, once they get to know what they're doing and what you want them to do, they're extremely friendly, and they can do this job. And sometimes if they're not given the job, they're kind of upset because that's their way of life. And so they had horses on treadmills so that the horse would generate power that way. And so if you were wanting to cut corn stalks into silage, then you would have a treadmill that would run the chaff cutter. But then the next step in the granary business was that you had to have it stored. So you had elevators, and some of them were wood, most of them were wood. Even if you didn't have any wood, you had to import it in from perhaps Texas or some of the elevators we take out from time to time are yellow pine, and that probably came from Texas. Other materials would come from Wisconsin. So then you had grain mills. They were sometimes run by water. In a flat landscape, the water still runs down the hill just a little bit. So you go back a mile or so, and you take off some water, and you keep it coming at a level that's a little higher, and then it runs into a wheel that has buckets on it, and that becomes your power. Some of those mills, the mill races at least, are around. If I go to Conkey Town near to Oakwood, there used to be such a organization, and the race that was bringing in the water at a slightly higher level is still there. If you're a historian, you might someday want to recreate that mill so that people would understand how their early settlers worked. You would have blacksmiths, and you would shoe horses, and you would create plows, and you had to have a plow that had a very long rollover. If you had a short, dumpty plow, it just accumulated wet prairie soils and didn't go very far, so you had to have a long rollover for the cutter underneath to cut the soil under and on the side, and you then rolled it over. The prairie was a challenge. The plants were called weeds, warts, curses, and anything that had a bad name because they had to be taken out. So think about your history and the little pieces. I came through Fithian after being in Oakwood, and the depot is still there, and that's nice, and that people are actually living in it. They've put a related extension on it, and that will become part of the Kickapoo Trail, the sociological part of the Kickapoo Trail. I think we're nearly to the end. Thanks for listening, and think about helping us out on Monday. We'll be here at 9 o'clock, next door to Weft, on Market Street in downtown Champaign. It's not anywhere else. It's right downtown, across from the poor.
Collective Poor
And
in Neubauer.
So it's not easy to park, but we won't be here for very long. We'll leave at 9 a.m. And thank you for being interested. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.